Thanks, Don. As Don said, my name is Susan Pond. I'm always honoured to stand before you as President of the Royal Society of New South Wales. Welcome to this inaugural meeting of the series, Provocations and Inspirations, which is being held at lunchtime, an unusual step for the Society. And welcome, of course, to our inaugural speaker, Ken Henry, and to members of the Society and to members of the Union University and Schools Club. I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which this club stands, and I pay my respect to elders past and present. As the oldest learned society in the Southern Hemisphere, the Royal Society of New South Wales has an acclaimed record of building the intellectual and social capital of New South Wales and Australia. We see our role today as being as important as ever because knowledge is critical to our future, not just for the select few, but for society as a whole. Our role today is as important as ever because decisions that are critical to Australia's future must be based on deep subject matter expertise and must embrace the entire spectrum of the human intellect. The Society concerns itself with this entire spectrum spanning the sciences and humanities. And this brings me to this new lunchtime series. Its aims are twofold. As Don said, to provoke discussion based on deep subject matter expertise on a highly complex topic of importance to Australia. And through this, inspire actions that will transform lives in unique ways. So I pause here to formally thank the members of the Society who've initiated this series, singling out Don Hector, former President of the Society and current Secretary, and Christy Slade, Chair of our Activities with Impact program. Who better to inaugurate this lunchtime series on provocations and inspirations than Dr. Ken Henry AC? Which topic could be better to tackle than his topic of inequality in Australia? Ken Henry AC is well known by reputation, at least, to all of us. An economist, former Commonwealth public servant, including serving as Secretary of the Department of Treasury from 2001 to 2011, and former Chair of the National Australia Bank, Ken's roles and achievements are far too many to recount here. You'll find them very easily with just a little research. Ken's current roles, including as Chair of the Nature Finance Council, speak to his lifelong dedication to the welfare and care of native wildlife in Australia. His entire career speaks to his dedication to the welfare and care of the Australian population. Ken, welcome to the lectern to share your deep expertise about the reasons for and the consequences of inequality and the actions to address them. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that very warm introduction. I hope I do it justice. I've passed the first test. I've managed to open this damn thing. I have prepared an address. I hope I leave ample time for questions, for challenge. I should say that what I'm going to say to you today is designed to be provocative. Nevertheless, what I'm going to say to you today reveals things about which I feel quite deeply and believe I've thought quite a lot. And one of the reasons I want to say some of these things today is because I do believe that the narrative in Australia is not a sound narrative. and I'm not sure it ever was. Australia has a reputation for egalitarianism. This reputation is not deserved. This is a nation based on mercantilist plunder. 250 years after the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, our leaders continue to insist that the prosperity of every citizen rests upon a trickling down of bounty from the export of raw materials. This simplistic narrative is told and retold by almost every newspaper editor in the country over and over again, as if it's some Gregorian chant without end. Anybody who's ever taken even an introductory course in economics should be uncomfortable with this story. But I wonder how many understand how our celebration of mercantilist plunder has contributed to an erosion of the nation's manufacturing capability, how it's undermined labour productivity growth, and how it's depressed the living standards of Australian workers. I wonder how many understand how this narrative has contributed to growing inequality in Australia, especially as between successive generations. Australians are, of course, aware that the living standards of today's workers are under pressure. Australians now have lived experience of the impacts of climate change and of large-scale environmental degradation. Australians know that these impacts are getting worse and that they will be much worse for their children and their grandchildren. And they are aware of a growing concentration of wealth, increasingly in the hands of those who control access to the continent's natural capital and those who no longer work for a living. These developments are part of a broader intergenerational tragedy that also features young workers being denied a reasonable prospect of home ownership, young workers burdened by mountains of public debt and the punishing costs of securing a tertiary education, young workers held back by a broken tax system that preferences all others above them. Why has this been tolerated? One explanation, voiced often in various groups concerned by what they see happening around them, is that all these things are the consequence of market systems designed by heartless neoclassical economists like me, who are prisoners of abstract theories. And that perspective is understandable. But the truth is much worse than that. The intergenerational tragedy playing out in Australia could have been avoided had our political system not been so dysfunctional. Its leaders less inclined to turn a deaf ear to well-reasoned policy advice drawn from those textbooks of neoclassical economics. But I shouldn't blame our political leaders either. After all, they are the product of a democratic system. Instead, we need to look at those who elect them. We need to look at ourselves, all of us. Every generation of Australians since the first wave of European settlement has celebrated plunder, dumb luck, and finders keepers. That is what Australians mean by a fair go. In considering the merits of any policy proposal, every generation of Australians accorded the privilege of suffrage will only ever ask one question: what's in it for me? And because we celebrate plunder, we idolise those who plunder the most. These are our role models. There is no Australian success story more wholeheartedly celebrated than the export of something taken from nature. Because our political leaders know this, they work hard to be seen to be complicit in these stories. A graphic example, I had to dig this one out, but it was seared in my brain, is then Prime Minister John Howard's wanting to take some credit for the announcement on the 8th of August 2002, it's an auspicious day, 8th of the 8th, 2002, of a 25-year Australian LNG supply contract to China, the very first LNG supply contract to China. According to Mr. Howard, persuading China to relieve us of some of the burden of our natural gas reserves was a great Australian team effort. Those are his words, great Australian team effort. Team Australia, all of us. 2 decades later, Australia is the world's second largest exporter of natural gas, and the fossil fuel industry is warning that we don't have enough gas available domestically to heat homes on the east coast of Australia. So a gas import terminal is being constructed on the New South Wales coast. Apparently, it should be underwritten by the Australian taxpayer. This is the sort of game Team Australia plays, and it says it all, really. It's time to ask ourselves some serious questions about the consequences of our fair go ethos. Questions like these. Why have we supported a set of public policies that have heavily degraded the natural environment? A set of policies that have energised a drift of wealth away from workers in favour of retirees, property owners and mercantile interests, and entrenched an economic structure that for 2 decades has delivered very low productivity and real wages growth. Over the first 2 decades of the 21st century, please eat, don't worry about me, you're not going to make me feel hungry. Over the first 2 decades of the 21st century, as productivity growth slowed sharply, the structurally adjusted level of Commonwealth government spending accelerated, increasing at almost precisely the rate projected in the first intergenerational report, which I led the development of, published in 2002. And despite the warnings written into that intergenerational report, including the ones that I wrote into it, the tax system that Australian governments have been relying upon to support that spending is in much worse shape today than it was then. There has been no structural reform of the tax system in the past 24 years. For more than 2 decades, we've been on notice that our tax system will prove incapable of delivering what will be asked of it, but we just couldn't be bothered. The present generation of Australians faces a reckoning. This is the first generation of Australians unable to make a credible claim that future generations will be better off than they are. That's a serious matter. An inability to make that claim threatens a key pillar of the social compact upon which the legitimacy of our democratic system of governance depends. There's a narrow pathway out of this emergent intergenerational tragedy and the threat that it poses to Australian democracy. But navigating it will not be easy. It will take uncommon leadership that makes the case for this generation not merely asking what is in it for them, but instead doing what they can to secure prosperity for future generations of Australians. So I want to talk to you about 5 topics relevant to this challenge. First, the interconnectedness of political power, national endowments, individual capability and inequality. Second, the foundational role played by natural capital. Third, some aspects of trends in the functional distribution of income that are highly relevant to Australia's experience and not at all understood. Fourth, capability investments that should be being made in this, the Asian century. And fifth, the structure of taxation. Inequality in the distribution of political power is a matter that has concerned moral philosophers and economists for hundreds of years. Adam Smith, after all, was a moral philosopher. 2 dimensions have been the focus of attention: short-termism and corporatism. Short-termism is a consequence of the inescapable fact of life that only the present generation has access to political power. The fact that necessarily poses a considerable risk to those not yet born. And the unhealthy consequences of corporatism was the principal motivator for Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations 250 years ago. In his book entitled The Price of Inequality, published more than a decade ago now, Joe Stiglitz draws attention to some of the capabilities required of individual agents if they are to be able to participate fully in economic activity. he explains how capability deprivation contributes to a concentration of income and wealth, how that in turn leads to a concentration of political power that distorts the pattern of public investment in capability building for individuals and the nation, and how inequality in the distribution of aggregate income and wealth undermines growth in these aggregates. The importance of an emphasis on capabilities has long been articulated by another philosopher and economist, Amartya Sen. The capabilities perspective that he's been outlining for decades is central to the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission's report published 15 years ago now on the measurement of economic performance and social progress. Amartya Sen emphasises individual capability not only because of its implications for aggregate outcomes, but because individual capability is a matter of primary interest in itself. Indeed, he would say the primary matter in any discussion of inequality. According to Sen, the core concern of all of us should be the extent to which individuals enjoy a set of capabilities that provides them the freedom to choose a life that they have reason to value, a life that they have reason to value. The political system that we have can pander to sectional interests for a very long time, as Australia's patronage of its extractive industries illustrates. Yet it would be prudent to assume that the legitimacy of a political system is fragile. Paraphrasing both Sen and Stiglitz, I would venture that trust in democracy is underwritten by a social compact that's really in the nature of a golden rule in two parts. First, all citizens in the present generation should have capabilities that allow them to lead lives that they have reason to value. And second, the present generation, being the only generation with political power, will do what it can to ensure that future generations are even better off. The capabilities enjoyed by citizens are underwritten by national endowments. Some of these national endowments are a consequence of nature, components of what these days we refer to as natural capital. But others have been developed by earlier generations of humans. These include, in the case of Australia, the products of foundational investments in things like our rich Indigenous cultures, modern multiculturalism, visual and performing arts, our legal and regulatory structures, education and health facilities, systems supporting research and innovation, economic and social infrastructure, physical and financial capital, of course, policy frameworks that promote freedom and economic security, and working conditions that support human dignity. These are not natural endowments. These endowments are national endowments created by humans, actually some in this room, but of course also earlier generations of humans who have lived on this continent. Investments in national endowments should be designed to expand opportunity and enhance the freedom of all Australians, including those not yet born, to choose a life that they will have reason to value. Capability deprivation provides a powerful explanation for extreme inequality. For example, Indigenous disadvantage is overwhelmingly a consequence of a lack of access to the nation's endowments, both natural and created. And our appalling record of species extinction constitutes another form of capability deprivation with generational distributional consequence. The present generation and all future generations have been denied access to national endowments to which past generations had access. You can read more about that in the writings of Amartya Sen, by the way. Of course, equality of access to national endowments does not necessarily mean that all citizens will have the same opportunity, the same freedom to choose a life that they will have reason to value. But a lack of equal access, unless it's calibrated to compensate for all instances of innate disadvantage in a manner that might be favoured by John Rawls, for example, and some of you would be familiar with his writings. That does mean, unless is calibrated in that way, it does mean that some will be denied the capability to choose a life of value. This form of capability deprivation should be assessed both spatially, that is within the present generation, if you like, and temporally, specifically in intergenerational terms. A few remarks about the foundational role played by natural capital. Human progress measured in economic or broader social terms has relied upon models of industrial production, including agriculture, of course, but not only agriculture, based on the extraction of non-renewable raw materials like iron ore, coal and gas, and the absorption of a stream of ecosystem services derived from things like fresh water, from our forests, from marine life, from arable soils, or what used to be arable soils, and various natural waste absorbers. The Brundtland report, which some of you would be familiar with, published way back in 1987, framed sustainable development in intergenerational equity terms. It noted that development that deprives future generations of the ability to meet their needs cannot be considered sustainable. Needs. In an address delivered in 1991, economist Robert Solow offered the perspective that sustainability is, and I'll quote, a moral obligation to conduct ourselves so that we leave to the future the option or the capacity to be as well off as we are. Thus, Solow too couches sustainable development in intergenerational equity terms. But his concept of well-being, you might have noticed, goes well beyond human needs. It includes an appreciation of environmental amenity, or what he calls our desire for unspoiled nature. Solow notes reasonably that when we think about our own well-being, or that of our family or our community, or even the well-being of a whole generation, we should, quote, recognise that different amenities really are to some extent substitutable for one another. Thus, we might see an opportunity for enhanced well-being in trading some amount of environmental amenity for economic and social advancement. For example, we might choose, as we have chosen, to substitute a year's supply of firewood for the environmental amenity derived from a 500-year-old eucalypt. These are the sorts of choices humans have been making for centuries, choosing to plunder the environment in the interests of economic and social progress of individuals, families and communities. It's been the rational thing to do. It's been an easy choice to make. After all, it's not something that any of us has had to pay for until now. Today, all the ecosystem services supplied by nature that are critical to human development are facing a set of extreme challenges, from climate change, loss of biodiversity, deforestation, and the collapse of ecosystem functioning. And these challenges pose existential risks to businesses, to economies and financial systems everywhere on Earth. Employment opportunities are being impacted, productivity is being undermined. Accumulated stores of material and financial wealth are now exposed to nature risks so extreme as to be uninsurable. Human cultures, livelihoods, and lives are being lost. So much for sustainable development. The 1992 Rio Earth Summit conceptualised the sustainability challenge in terms of, and I'll quote again, integrating and balancing economic, social and environmental concerns in meeting our needs, unquote. Terrible statement in my view. World leaders would have done better explaining the need to construct models of development that acknowledge the biophysical limits of the finite planet. Models that recognise that those limits constitute a set of immutable constraints that humans should respect, that the state of the environment is not merely one among many choice variables that humans might play around with in various trade-offs and balancing acts over and over without end. In embracing the sustainability language of balancing and trade-offs, we have accepted the notion that human development rests on the continuing plunder of natural capital. It's well past time we understood that securing economic and social development rests upon the rebuilding of natural capital, not its plunder. This is a matter of primary distributional importance. The rebuilding of natural capital, often referred to these days as nature positive, provides an opportunity for this generation to affirm its moral obligation to future generations, to ensure, in Robert Solo's words, that we leave to the future the option or the capacity to be as well off as we are. Now a little bit about the functional distribution of income. An obvious feature of the capitalist system is that it tends to generate an ongoing accumulation of physical capital through saving and investment. This is its great strength. Ironically, the fact that it has tended also to degrade the stock of natural capital hasn't received a great deal of attention until recently. What has received far more attention, at least from economists, is the question of what the process of capital accumulation does to the distribution of income, as between capitalists and workers. This functional distribution of income question was, for example, a rather obvious interest of Karl Marx, but it continues to be of central interest to economists. In more recent times, the French economist Thomas Piketty has argued that because the rate of return on capital has typically exceeded the rate of workforce growth, we should expect to see the distribution of factor incomes becoming increasingly biased toward capital. Yet, in Australia, actually, the aggregate capital-labour ratio stopped growing about a decade ago. And whilst it experienced a brief period of growth in the subsequent period, it's been falling for some years now. This is a consequence of chronically weak business investment. The behaviour of Australia's aggregate capital-labour ratio can in part be explained by the resources boom. But that boom has had an impact on the distribution of incomes between capital and labour through a transmission mechanism that doesn't depend at all upon its impact on the aggregate capital-labour ratio. And by the way, I realised when I started thinking about this, I guess, in about 2003, 2004, and I realised that I was a teenager still when I first learnt the neoclassical theory to explain this, and I don't think anybody else in my department of the Treasury had a clue. I'm going to try it on you. At the start of the 21st century, China had about 1/5 of the world's population. Having been closed off from the rest of the world economy for some time, in the last quarter of the 20th century, it chose to embrace market economics and international trade. It opened itself up to international trade. 20 years into the 21st century, it had become the major trading partner of more than 120 countries, being the largest national source of imports into both those countries in the European Union and the United States. And it was buying more than a third of Australia's total exports of all kinds. Well, standard international trade theory would predict that a global shock of that magnitude is going to have a profound impact on the distribution of income as between workers and the owners of capital in every trading nation in the world. Consistent with the theory, China's exports have been dominated by relatively labour-intensive products, mainly manufacturers, and its imports by relatively capital-intensive products, especially minerals and energy. According to standard international trade theory, and in the absence of any border tax adjustment like a tariff on imports or an export tax, we should have expected to see the following pattern of economic impacts in every one of China's trading partners in the developed world, irrespective of whether that trading partner ends up being a net exporter to China or a net importer from China. First, the domestic prices of labour-intensive products like manufacturers will fall relative to the domestic prices of capital-intensive products like minerals and energy. Well, yes, that's happened all over the world. Two, the reward of labour, that is wages, will fall relative to the reward to capital, that is profits. That has happened all over the developed world in every one of China's trading partners. Three, labour productivity will fall in all industries. And four, relative to the owners of capital, workers are unambiguously worse off. In contrast, Chinese workers benefit relative to the owners of capital. Now, of course, this is very standard international trade theory. Of course, there are a lot of other factors influencing relative factor prices, labour productivity, and so on. But those insights from standard trade theory do a pretty good job of describing the real economic impact on all developed nations, including Australia, of China's re-emergence as a global economic power in the first quarter of the 21st century. As China has opened to international trade, it's experienced persistently large trade surpluses, I mean exports exceeding imports, with the major developed economies of the United States and the European Union. These former manufacturing powerhouses, with large trade deficits to China, have had little difficulty seeing a relationship between China's expansion and a decline in the living standards of their workers, and that explains much of the febrile politics that you see on both continents. But Team Australia hasn't got it. To the contrary, we seem to believe that our sales of non-renewable resources to China and other rapidly industrialising nations in Asia, but mainly China, have underwritten prosperity for all Australians. This rather exceptional Australian perspective can probably be explained by the fact that, unlike almost every other developed economy, Australia has experienced a persistent trade surplus with China. We export more to China than we import from it. But as any undergraduate student of trade theory would be able to tell you, the distribution of gains from international trade as between capital and labour, workers and capitalists, has nothing at all to do with the trade balance. It has nothing to do with whether a country experiences a trade surplus or a trade deficit. It is driven rather by what happens to the prices of the things that the country trades. China's engagement in world trade has reduced the relative price of labour-intensive products. That is, it has increased the relative price of capital-intensive products in all of its trading partners, including Australia. As the relative prices of labour-intensive products have fallen, the United States and the large manufacturing nations in the EU have experienced modest reductions in their terms of trade, the ratio of the average price of exports to the average price of imports. But because we have a comparative advantage in highly capital-intensive resources extraction, especially minerals and fossil fuels, Australia's terms of trade have increased. Indeed, as early as 2012, our terms of trade were double what they'd been only a decade earlier. Well, large increases in the terms of trade are a big deal for those charged with macroeconomic management, but they don't directly have a huge impact on the distribution of income as between capital and labour. The principal macroeconomic impact of a doubling the terms of trade in Australia has been an appreciation of Australia's real exchange rate. I'll go through this in questions if you like, but the real exchange rate, and this will mean something to some in the audience, of 70% between the June quarter 2002 and the June quarter 2012. And that had a profound impact on the competitiveness of all Australian import competing businesses. To get your head around it, it is broadly equivalent to removing a 70% across the board tariff. 70% tariff that applies to absolutely every import, just take it away. And that's what Australia experienced between 2002 and 2012. Over that period, hours worked in Australian manufacturing fell by 10.3%, falling from 11.4% of total employment to 8.4% of total employment in Australia. Over the past 20 years, Australian manufacturing has lost 200 workers a week. 200 workers a week for 20 years. Between 2002 and 2012, mining share of total employment measured in hours worked increased from 1.1% to 1.2%. You'll probably recall that as mining exports were accelerating, our political leaders were wringing their hands over Australia's two-speed economy. But they refused even to wonder whether the damage being done to those in the slow lane might have had something to do with the frenzy of activity taking place in the fast lane. The damage done to Australian manufacturing by a 70% appreciation of the real exchange rate in the first decade of the 21st century could have been avoided. For an economist, right, this goes to something we were discussing just now. For an economist like me, it is beyond irony to witness today's leaders turn to jelly when confronted with a claim that attending to the environmental risks posed by a new mining proposal will destroy hundreds of jobs, when I know that those same leaders have done absolutely nothing to prevent the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs in manufacturing over the past 2 decades. And I suggest it is simply obscene to see some of those same people now posturing as champions of a made-in-Australia manufacturing strategy. Give me a break. But what about the impact on the living standards of Australian workers generally of China's engagement in world trade? Well, what matters here is not whether a country's terms of trade have improved or deteriorated, only what's happened to the domestic price of labour-intensive products relative to the domestic price of capital-intensive products. Thus, even though Australia's terms of trade have moved in the opposite direction from those of the US and the major EU countries, workers in Australia have been affected in precisely the same way. Labour productivity has fallen or has grown more slowly in every sector in the Australian economy, and the living standards of domestic workers have declined relative to the owners of capital. Since Australian exports are relatively capital intensive, a doubling in Australia's terms of trade implies that in the absence of any border tax adjustment, the relative domestic price of labour-intensive products falls on average by about 50%. There is no other developed economy that has experienced such a large negative shock to the living standards of its workers. We are a world leader in accepting this. Note that shock doesn't necessarily translate into a declining share of wages in gross domestic product, and that's because gross domestic product growth is also negatively impacted by weaker labour productivity growth, of course. And thus, if you go and check the numbers, Labour's share in gross domestic product was 40% both in the June quarter 2002 and again in the June quarter 2012. But over the decade, from the June quarter 2002, Australia experienced staggeringly poor annual productivity growth, averaging less than 1%. Underwriting anemic, in some years even negative, real wages growth. Negative real wages growth. I never thought I'd see that, other than in a recession. All sectors of the economy have been affected. Some of you are going to find this hard to believe, and I was a little shocked myself at the size of it, but labour productivity in the mining industry, measured by real gross value added per employee, fell by 46% over the decade from the June quarter 2002. And that, by the way, has absolutely nothing to do with mining-related construction activity. Well, standard trade theory says that this is what should be expected. The damage done to the living standards of Australian workers through its impact on labour productivity growth is not a consequence of systems designed by heartless economists, prisoners of abstract neoclassical theories. To the contrary, it's due to the steadfast refusal of legislators to take any interest in those theories. And it's not merely neoclassical economic theory that supports a conclusion that the resources boom has undermined Australian productivity growth. I suggest you only need to take a look at the national accounts. According to my calculations, using some very basic linear econometrics, the resources boom explains 2/3 of the deterioration in Australia's productivity growth performance so far this century, relative to the last 3 decades of the 20th century. How are we going for time?
Got another 5 minutes?
All right, I'm going to...
But you can go.
No, it's okay.
Go longer if you want to. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll just say a few words about capability investments in the Asian century. There's something here I need to get off my chest. Do you remember the white paper on Australian Asian century, right? The focus on national endowments illuminates the need to ensure that Australians are endowed with the capabilities that will be relevant to success in the Asian century. Success in the Asian century for Australia will come from integration based on complementarity, not from a race to the bottom in wages, social foundations or environmental standards. In managing the risks of growing Australian inequality, there is a need for new foundational investments, including public investments in our schools, our universities, our vocational training centres, in developing Asia-capable workplaces and institutions, and encouraging adaptability. The case for making these investments was set out in some detail in the White Paper on Australia in the Asian Century. That white paper explained how past capability investments provide a contemporary basis of comparative advantage, or you could call it competitive advantage. Both labels are appropriate in this case. These capabilities include excellence in governance, relatively low levels, although I'm starting to wonder about that one honestly, but anyway, relatively low levels of corruption, safe working conditions, a concern, although not as strong as it needs to be, with environmental sustainability and animal welfare, also not as strong as it needs to be, and institutions that support social harmony, economic and social opportunity, and tolerance. All of these attributes support opportunity and freedom for this and future generations of Australians. They improve the well-being of the Australian people by enhancing their prospects of choosing a life they will have reason to value. But a mercantilist will argue that all of these things are costly, that Australia's international competitiveness will be improved by ditching all of them. And let's not kid ourselves, all are at risk. Upon election of the Abbott government, every discoverable printed copy of the Asia Century White Paper in Canberra was literally pulped, and every government-supported digital link to it was severed overnight. Now I've got to say something about taxation. Speaking of reports that have had a big impact, the tax review commissioned by the Rudd government early in 2008 provided an opportunity for a group of tax policy experts to consider how the tax and transfer system might best evolve to meet the challenges of the 21st century and to underwrite future prosperity. That review, as you know, was published more than 14 years ago. The review team, which I had the privilege of leading, identified challenges associated with strong population growth and population ageing, the Asian century, which I've spoken about, climate change and widespread environmental destruction, which I've spoken about, and developments in digital communications and commerce, which I don't have time to talk about today. And we called out worsening housing affordability as a matter much in need of policy attention. Our review identified the several potential sources of revenue. There's no brilliance in this. Labour income, the normal return to capital, transactions, land, consumption, wealth, natural resources, windfall capital gains, economic rents, environmental externalities, including carbon emissions, and of course user charges. We noted that replacing reliance upon the first three of these potential sources of revenue, that is labour income, the normal return to capital and transactions, puts at risk the living standards of future generations by retarding productivity growth and workforce participation. We argued the case for reducing reliance on these sources and placing much greater emphasis on all others. But understanding these things and convincing others of them are very different exercises. A nation that celebrates plunder and dumb luck and respects finders keepers will not easily see a case for extracting more revenue from natural resources, including fossil fuels, for extracting more revenue from windfall capital gains, from economic rents or environmental externalities. It will have no tolerance of land taxes or indeed any other tax on wealth. The centrepiece of the Asprey Review of Taxation, published half a century ago, was the need to rebalance the burden of taxes between wages, other forms of income broadly defined, and consumption. That's what it was all about. Among the various forms of non-wage income, capital gains have posed the biggest political challenge. There are still some who would want you to believe that capital gains must bear some attachment to the fundamentals. For example, that increases in housing prices must always reflect an expectation of rising rents, or at least a rental opportunity. But there is in fact no reason to expect any such attachment. Capital gains in housing are usually no better attached to fundamentals than gains in the dollar value of gold, of Bitcoin, a range of non-fungible tokens, and so on. It's often the case that capital gains arise because of nothing more than an expectation of capital gains. And sometimes it's no more explicable than winning a jackpot on the pokies. Thus, in a society that celebrates dumb luck, capital gains will be assured of very special status. Consumption taxation has been no easier, and reform outcomes nearly as disappointing. The Goods and Services Tax, the GST, commenced operation on the 1st of July 2000. The tax mix switch achieved with the introduction of the GST has been fully undone. Indeed, it was undone in less than 2 decades, with indirect taxes contributing the same share of total revenue as way back in 1997, 1998. We're back to where we were in the several decades following World War II that led ultimately to the Asprey Review. Ill-disciplined government funded by fiscal drag that punishes innovation, enterprise and effort, distorts the pattern of saving and rewards tax avoidance and evasion. We haven't managed to sustain any tax reform effort at all this century. There have been attempts and they have failed. We know that placing exclusive reliance upon fiscal drag in the personal income tax system threatens the social compact. This was a conclusion of the Asprey Review 50 years ago, but there's a bigger risk now. From the 1960s, the share of taxpayers in the population grew strongly. Today, demographic trends are working in the opposite direction, to reduce the share of the population that will be paying income tax. A heavier and heavier burden is being placed on the shoulders of a declining proportion of the population. There's a lot that can be said about much needed reforms to the Australian tax system, and the Tax Review published 14 years ago devoted 1,000 pages of text to that end. So what I'm really saying is go and read it, please. One thing worth keeping in mind as you think about tax reform requirements today, though, is that when we were working on that project through 2008 and 2009 and wrestling with the global financial crisis and a lot of other stuff that was going on, we were confident that the Rudd government's world-leading climate policy would be legislated. Its absence implies the need to explore ways in which the Australian tax system might best contribute to reducing carbon emissions and indeed removing past emissions from the atmosphere. This is not the occasion for talking about these things, although if you, well, maybe who knows, you might ask about them in question time, but they must be top of mind in any tax reform discussion. Almost all the historical discourse on the fairness of various tax reform proposals in Australia, and this is where I'm going to conclude, by the way, has been framed in intra-generational terms, intra-generational, as in within the present generation. And after all, we are the only people who have the power to vote. Usually, the analysis has evaluated comparative static changes in the progressivity of a tax. If it's a system, progressivity of the overall system with current income as the denominator. In that framing, many of the much needed reforms to the Australian tax system will be labelled regressive. I'll make 2 points here, and this is where I'm going to conclude. First, the interests of the most disadvantaged are not being served by a tax system that is punishing innovation, denying people opportunity, undermining economic growth, and threatening the sustainability of government service provision. And second, and more to the point, the present tax system amounts to a conspiracy against future generations. If this generation is to make any credible claim that future generations of Australians will be better off than we are, then far-reaching tax reforms in the direction I have spelled out are unavoidable.
So, thank you for that very powerful address, Ken. And now we have an opportunity for questions. I'm going to ask one straight off that occurred to me as you were talking. Looking back at the mining boom, and as you did, pointing out that the end result is low productivity and wage stagnation, in fact, wages going backwards in the last 2 or 3 years, how would you treat a counterfactual, namely that of Norway, which in about the same time as we rejected a 20% resource rent tax, imposed a 76% resource rent tax on their oil and gas assets, which was then used to create the world's largest sovereign wealth fund. Can you imagine, or allow us to imagine, what Australia would have looked like had we done something on that scale?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I've thought about this a lot. I'll say a couple of things. We could talk about this for hours, honestly. Well, we would still have a vibrant manufacturing sector, Roy. That's one thing for sure, absolutely. Do you know, the very first piece, look, it was informal, so I shouldn't be too distressed about this, I imagine, but the very first piece of economic advice I ever gave to the incoming Rudd government was to put a big tax on resources exports in November of 2007, that was. And of course they laughed. How could a mercantilist tax exports? Are you crazy? That's what Norway does. A couple of years ago, you'll recall we had an angst-ridden discussion in Australia about what was happening to domestic gas prices. Simple high school economics tells you that if you want to have domestic gas prices lower than world price and you are the second largest exporter of gas in the world, put a tax on the gas exports, for God's sake. It's not hard. It's pretty simple stuff, right? And by the way, our gas exports will one day in the not too distant future be taxed, but not by us, because we're stupid mercantilists. They're going to be taxed by the European Union under their carbon border adjustment mechanism. And they've already told us, and they've told us when it's going to start. And by all of those other countries that we export to that are going to copy the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism. But I would predict that we are too stupid and too locked in this mercantilist mindset, this narrative of Australian development, to understand that we should tax them here before they leave Australia. Am I talking about something consequential or not? You asked about the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. It's only back of the envelope calculations, but that tax at the present CBAM shadow price, which is really the price at which carbon credits are presently trading in Europe, would generate for Australia $156 billion a year. That's what it would generate. And if you think about it, why is that number so big? Well, the carbon embodied in Australia's fossil fuel exports is 3 times what we count as our national emissions from all sources, because we don't count the carbon embodied in the stuff that other people buy from us and burn. We don't count that in our national emissions. That's why the number's so big, $156 billion a year. I reckon you could do a bit with that, Roy. I reckon. And I reckon the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund would be absolutely tiny relative to Australia's Sovereign Wealth Fund. I remember on many occasions as the mining boom was getting underway, appearing in public forums and being asked the question, why doesn't Australia have a sovereign wealth fund? And I was always a bit, surprised by the question, because we were incapable of putting a tax on even just supernormal profits from the mining sector. A country that lacks either the intelligence or the courage to be able to do that, which is a rather obvious thing to do, should stop dreaming about sovereign wealth funds, I reckon. Certainly anything approaching the Norwegian scale.
Just on that note, I asked someone from Equinor the other day, because they're going to invest in offshore wind in Australia. how much tax they paid last year. 80 billion euro, and they were still making a profit. Paying the NDIS 4 or 5 times over.
Yeah.
Yes, up the back there.
Oh, okay, we've provoked something now, right?
Dr. Henry, thanks very much for your thanks very much for your
Maybe just say who you are and then.
and Stephen Burns, I'm a member of the Royal Society. Can we go right to the top? In inequality, there couldn't be anything more unequal than the ability of a citizen to approach a politician or their staffers than the huge lobbying sector which makes huge profits for the people who live. So any commentary on how we're going to break this nexus? Because basically all doing is questions about why we're not doing things.
Yep.
It all comes back to the decision makers, and the decision makers' perspective on things is being incredibly influenced by these organisations. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's true. It is true, and of course, I've had the opportunity to see it firsthand. Spending 28 years in policy advising in Canberra. It is true, and it's actually what. And I referred to Joe Stiglitz's book, The Price of Inequality. It's the thing that he draws out. It's actually the thing that Adam Smith refers to in The Wealth of Nations, 1776, that it's those with economic power who have the opportunity to exert political power. And the use of that political power gives them more economic power, and round and round and round it goes in this destructive cycle of increasing economic power, increasing political power, and so on. And you've got to break it. It has to be broken. But it's not surprising that would happen in a democracy where political parties need to compete actively against one another. I used to think this is only something that happened during election campaign. When I was working in Paul Keating's office as an advisor, which I did for 5 years, the ethos in the office was that you had to win the parliamentary term. You had to win the debate for the parliamentary term. And that included being seen to be successful in introducing and getting legislation passed. And by the time that Rudd became Prime Minister, it was every 5 minutes of every day. You had to be winning, right? And look, it's not just the politicians who are under the heady influence of economic power and reliant upon donations and so on from those who have the economic power. There's also the media. In the rather terrible media debate that we had in Australia on the resources super profits tax, I got so annoyed, and I was Treasury Secretary at the time. I got so annoyed. It was the only time in my life that I ever did it. I called the editor of the Financial Review and said, "You're a joke, mate. What the hell are you doing?" What the hell? Because of the editorial line that was being written, which was the one that I read out there. It's the Australian mercantilist narrative. The exports of fossil fuels and iron ore are the source of Australian prosperity. Only a dumbass would want to put a tax on this stuff. This amounts to, what was the phrase? Killing the goose that's laying the golden eggs. That was the phrase. Right. And his response was, well, every business we talk to, I guess he meant Minerals Council associated business. Every business we talk to tell us that this is crazy. Simple as that. The role of the media is meant to be to call this stuff out, not to be complicit in it, and we've lost that.
Yes. Thank you, Rosalind Croucher, fellow of the Royal Society. Thank you, Ken. That was a provocative talk. And it's raised some questions in my mind that are by way of observation on, and perhaps I can invite you to take them as a question or continuing the line that you've been developing. I think one of the key things you framed your talk around was a lack of political will and a failure of democracy. And I think what's troubled me in observing our political processes is the breakdown of the Westminster-style two-party system and the emergence of the smaller parties being able to hold to ransom, if you like, to achieve some kind of political concordat, to win to break through in an electoral sense. So it's how you manage that sense of need to have a political will to do the wonderful things or the brave things of which you've spoken in that context. And that is also linked to the second part that you were going to read just then, in terms of the way that the media can misdirect courting a kind of cheap popular spirit. And one of the examples I think most recently in my mind is the failure to maintain public housing stock over decades and decades and decades, and suddenly to point the finger at all of these immigrants as somehow to blame for a lack of access to housing. So it's sort of a combination of political will, change in the democratic structure, and misdirection in the press. So it's sort of a combo of things. Thank you.
Yeah. So how much time have we got? 60 minutes or so? No, it's a great question, and the comment as well. And and I know what you're talking about with public housing. I grew up in a public housing suburb. Mind you, for some reason we didn't have a public house, but anyway, we were pretty poor. My father was a timber worker on the lowest award rate of pay in the nation. But anyway, I know what those public housing estates did for people. Where I grew up, all of my friends that I went to school with were living in them. It's public housing. And our lack of investment in public housing is, I think, a disgrace. Anyway, on the media, I think it's kind of interesting to see editors of established newspaper names. I say established, that doesn't mean they're going to be with us much longer, but they are, and I don't think they will. But established, drawing a distinction between, the traditional media, or apparently those that you can trust, and those that are threatening their existence, and that's principally social media. I don't trust much that I read in that so-called traditional media. I've stopped subscribing. It's just, and maybe it's because they think the only way they can survive in this world of contest, sort of hyperventilated contest, is to be a participant in it and not to be different any longer. Anyway, that's how it looks to me. And all those newspapers getting thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner. How right you are, except for the advertising losses. That is remarkable. And so I think it's, if the traditional media thought that they were going to be able to continue to distinguish themselves from social media, they wouldn't have started to ape it. That's what they're doing, they're aping it. It's that sense to me. I did ask an audience once, not that long ago, I said, when was the last time you ever read any news in a newspaper? I mean, news, as in I wasn't aware of this until I read it in the newspaper. I don't know. So what you get in the newspapers today is commentary at best. At best, it's commentary Most of it's opinion. Whether it's fact-based or not, it's opinion. I don't have the answer to that, but I will say this, in coming back to dysfunctional democratic system. Look, and the minor parties. And Peter Shergold will remember this very well. You know, we've had minor parties holding the balance of power in the Australian political system in the upper house for a very long time. Anything difficult, as a public servant, you had to ask yourself, well, a lot of questions, but two in particular, right? Two in particular. One, is there any chance at all of getting this legislation through that upper house? And then the second, which is a rather more challenging question for a public servant to ask, but nevertheless you do have to ask it, is, do we have a political leader capable of running the argument publicly? Right? That's the thing that's been missing for a long time.
Thank you, Ken, for a very informative talk. My name's Dino Economo. I'm a member of the UUSC. I have a question that relates to...
You've got a great surname, by the way, mate.
Thank you. Thank you. I have studied a little bit of that as well. Currently, we hear of the cost of living crisis and the housing crisis. If you were Prime Minister, how would you solve both of those?
Well, okay, so the housing crisis, we've already had one suggestion on the housing crisis. Public housing, state of it, is a disgrace in Australia. I've said that very much. Anyway, that's one aspect of it. Look, there's no point pussyfooting around on this one, right? The capital gains tax preference for the family home, you know, $10 million house, $15 million, it could be a $50 million house sitting there on the harbour, no capital gains tax at all. And by the way, it doesn't count in the assets test for the pension. Try and get your head around that. That is kind of, that's one issue. The popular debate on the housing, the relationship between the tax system and housing affordability goes to the issue of what's called negative gearing. Negative gearing, there's nothing special about somebody who owns an investment property being able to deduct the expenses associated with that investment property, including mortgage interest, against income from any other source. You could invest in any income-producing asset of any sort, and you could do the same thing. You could negatively gear it, like shares, whatever, you know. That's not the issue. It's not what creates a negative gearing attraction. What creates a negative gearing attraction is that the capital gains tax, which you are presumably expecting to pay. I mean, after all, if you look at the rental yields, most times, if you look at the rental yields that landlords get, they're in the region, once you take out property tax, they're in the region of 2 to 3%. That only makes sense if you are expecting a large capital gain to make up the difference to other investment opportunities, right? But the way the capital gains tax works is, firstly, you don't pay it on an accruing basis. And by the way, I'm not suggesting you should. I understand the difficulties associated with that, and they're not just theoretical, they are quite practical. But only one half of the capital gain is assessed as taxable income and taxed at your marginal rate, whatever your marginal rate, or whatever, effectively at your marginal rate, whatever it happens to be whenever you decide to sell the rental property, right? And in that, there is, you don't need a very high rate of capital gain for that tax preference to generate sufficient attraction to explain why negative gearing is so popular. And of course, and you probably know this, Australia is a standout internationally in the attraction of rental property as an investment class for households. Absolute standout in other countries. comes close. Maybe there are some small ones that come close, but anyway, Australia is a standout relative to ones that we normally compare ourselves with, and it mostly has to do with those two things: lack of adequate public housing as an alternative for low-income rental, and secondly, the way the capital gains tax system works. As to cost of living crisis, the proximate cause of the cost of living crisis, in my view, is the washout from the COVID pandemic, which disrupted global supply chains in a way that nobody had foreseen. It's quite remarkable how quickly we turned from celebrating the just-in-time industrial model of the Japanese into, oh my God, this is now posing an existential threat to humanity, which it kind of does, right? And we hadn't thought about the risk. But what it did is it disrupted supply chains, and so, standard simple economics, the supply curve moves to the left. And if you don't do something on that demand curve, you're going to get higher prices, right? You're going to see inflation. And what the Reserve Bank has been doing is trying to move the demand curve to the left so that you don't get the price inflation, but you do get the fall off in economic activity. And their ability to achieve that outcome without securing a recession is quite remarkable. It's quite remarkable. But it does beg the question whether it might not have been prudent to wait a little to allow some of the adjustment to come through on the supply side.
There is a per capita.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
That affects individuals.
No. Don't get me wrong. Yeah, I agree with you. I agree. And so you do need, but then monetary policy can only do so much, right? Because what you need to do is you need to get that supply curve moving to the right. And what that means is you do have to be paying attention to the sources of productivity growth, for example. So maybe you should start looking at reforming the Australian taxation system in a way that drives productivity growth, right? And that generates two benefits that would help, not overnight, but would help to address the cost of living crisis. The first is it takes the pressure out of prices. And the second is that it provides the underpinnings for real wages growth and increase in productivity.
I think George was first at the back there.
I thoroughly enjoyed your talk. I'm George Mortimer. I'm a club member, but also a state colleague of Treasury colleague of Finn's. And so I was reminded in listening to you of why economics is often referred to as a business science. Because I'm trying to find a way forward when you mentioned opportunities, how our kids are going to have the sort of opportunities that we had, and maybe their standard of living would perhaps not decline, but maybe even grow from ours. So I'm trying to look out of all the things you said for a temporal perspective about where those opportunities might be. Now, historically, there have been three sources of a comparative advantage for Australia. I mean, there's the mineral sector. Now, maybe productivity has been declining, but certainly in an absolute sense, we do pretty well at picking things up. Maybe we should process more. Agricultural sector, always been important, still is. And then education become quite important, although lately we're doing our best to sort of cruel that in the last few months. So looking at where the comparative advantage for Australia might lie, how are we going to create these opportunities? I mean, we should be looking at things like future made in Australia, and maybe hybrids, and maybe more protectionism, which is probably driven more by geopolitical concerns than economic ones. But so where are we going to look for that employment growth? Leaving aside tax policy, I understand why it's important, but just look at the underlying economics. Where are those opportunities going to come from?
Well, a couple of things. Firstly, George, the sectors that you referred to as being drivers of comparative advantage, or sources of comparative advantage for Australia, have never been drivers of employment growth in Australia. The mining sector, which was your first example, has never employed more than 2.5% of the labour force, ever. And historically, and that's in a boom time, and historically it has employed between 0.9% and 2.1% of the Australian labour force. And if you do it in hours worked rather than heads basis, it's even less than that. Mining has been a great driver of exports, no doubt about that, but it has distributed very, very few benefits to the Australian worker, very few benefits, and that's because very few Australians work in mining. It is the most, in the national accounts, there's only one thing that has a higher capital to labour ratio than mining, and that's something called ownership of dwellings. That's because it's got no labour in it, it's all capital. But if you ignore ownership of dwellings, mining has a capital labour ratio that is several multiples of anything else, right? It doesn't contribute to the living standards of Australian workers. And as you know, George, I think most of the shares in the big multinational companies that exploit Australia's natural resources, like at least 3/4 are foreign owned, so foreign capitalists who get most of the benefit. Now, some of course does come accrued to Australian superannuation funds and beneficiaries in Australian superannuation funds, although Australian superannuation funds have long acted on the basis that they can get higher returns offshore than in Australia. They don't find Australia a particularly attractive place to invest either. Even in the middle of the global financial crisis, they were investing 35% of their assets in foreign equities, mainly in the United States. Not looking to Australia as a place to invest. So we've got to ask ourselves more fundamental questions, and some of the answers that you suggested there I think are right, George. We do have to look at our education system. We have to look, as I said in the prepared address, at building what I called Asia relevant capabilities. Do you know, in the Asia Century White Paper, we had the Australian government signing up to a proposition that by some year, I forget the year, but anyway, every child in an Australian school would have the opportunity to learn an Asian language. Right? Yeah. Think about it. Where did that go? Well, we know where that went, I told you. It was policy. So there, it's not too late. It is not too late to turn some of this around. It's just I don't see any of our current politicians capable of constructing a narrative that would carry the day. Because George, if I was Prime Minister, I said, oh no, maybe I didn't answer that. I would actually put a tax on Australia's fossil fuel exports equal to what the Europeans are going to tax them at within maybe 12 months or 2 years' time. I would do that, and I would raise $156 billion, and I would spend that in national development, rebuilding the productive capacity of the country. I would do that, and I would do more than that. With respect to meeting our own net zero by 2050 ambition, I would make sure that we did that in a way that directed very substantial amounts of funding to rebuilding the quality of natural capital across Australia, including in heavily degraded farming areas. And I know how to do it. And I do know, and we've had, anyway, a group of us have had this piece of policy work modelled, and it's pretty good modelling. Anyway, it's as good as anything the world has. I know a way of generating through our carbon policy $10 billion a year to invest in nature repair across the Australian landscape. Most of it going to farmers. We can do these things. And they're not that bloody complicated.
So we've got a few questions here. Ian, then back John.
Thanks, Ian Sloan. Thank you very much for a wonderful, provocative address. I wanted to just ask about taxation. Particularly, I look around the room here, I think that many of us in this room are in that category of people who are not drawing a current income, and it's one way or another are drawing pensions. I would love to show of hands. I suspect there'd only be few not drawing a pension, and of some kind. It is ridiculous that we don't pay any tax on pensions. I mean, that's something I never hear about, because it's probably so unlikely. I know the grey vote is always very important, but personally I think pensions should form part of the taxable income.
Yeah. Well, they do for me, because I'm on one of those lovely public sector superannuation schemes, so mine is taxed. But look, there's a lot in it. Look, when you consider the taxation of superannuation, there are three taxing points, right? So there's how much tax is paid when wages and or salary or any other form of income are kind of sacrificed, and instead of being used to finance current consumption, are directed into this tax preferred savings vehicle called the superannuation fund. So that's the contributions tax. And then there's the tax on the fund earnings. And how does that, you could ask yourself, how does that taxation rate compare with taxation rate on a bank account balance or dividends or rental property investment or whatever, all of which, apart from the bank account, are tax preferred. And then there's the one that you mentioned, which is, okay, when you make the withdrawal, how much tax do you pay? Now, when you withdraw money from the bank account, you don't pay any tax. That's because the interest on the bank account, well, firstly, it's because when you put the money into the bank account, the assumption is that it was fully taxed income, and you're only putting money in out of taxed income. Secondly, the interest income is fully accessible whilst it's in the bank account, and so it'd be madness to tax it on the way out as well, right? But how does superannuation compare with that? It's obviously tax preferred. Like a bank account, there's no tax on what you take out. There is a concessional rate of tax on the contributions going in, although that's no longer a single rate of 15%, depends upon your income. And there's tax on the earnings inside the superannuation fund. And again, that's not a single rate of tax. That also will depend upon the account balance shortly. Maybe it's already true. It's probably already true. But curiously, here's the thing that I really do not understand. If you are a pensioner like yourself, getting money out of the superannuation fund, what I've just said about the earnings is not true. They're actually exempt from tax. The earnings inside the superannuation fund are exempt from tax. Yeah, if you're drawing a pension, right, in the pension phase. I have never, ever been able to get my head around that. I cannot understand that one at all. It makes life rather complicated for superannuation funds because they have to decide which of the assets, which of the earnings are referable to which pool of assets, which are referable to the pension that's being paid out, and which are not. God, why would you do? Anyway, we've created that system. In the tax review, we recommended getting rid of that exemption so that all earnings are subject to tax. And then, if you want to reduce the concessionality of the superannuation system, you either work with the contributions tax or the earnings tax, or you think about a more comprehensive wealth tax. But we didn't recommend it. We just said think about a more comprehensive wealth tax, right? And that may be the only way of achieving the level of equity or fairness that you referred to.
Thank you.
Roy, could I exercise the power of the microphone?
Yes, sure.
It's not a very powerful microphone.
A quick question, Ken. You referred just a moment ago to wealth tax. In the Henry report, there was passing reference to wealth tax.
Yeah.
But no recommendation, just saying there should be a public debate.
Yeah.
You also referred to Piketty's work, which says that the returns to capital are greater than returns to labour.
Yeah.
Australia has done something of a job in rectifying that by making everyone who's got a compulsory superannuation account a capitalist because they're reliant on that to some degree when they retire. I recently did a back of the envelope calculation. If you taxed 5% of the top 200 wealthiest people in Australia, you could put $5,000 into a savings account for every single child in Australia. And if you did that from the date that they were born until the date they turned 18, they'd have a nest egg of about $100,000, which could very well much make the difference between owning a house by the time you retire and not owning a house. Any ideas on wealth tax generally?
Well done. That's my idea. Well done. This is, you're right. I mean, when we wrote the review, that was saying earlier, we referred to wealth taxation, but we didn't make a recommendation. But we did say there was a need for public debate on a wealth tax. We haven't had a lot, right? I mean, maybe you could argue that the housing affordability crisis is some form of debate on a wealth tax, but I don't think it is really. I think there is a need for Australia to have that sort of debate on a wealth tax. That, I don't know. I don't know what the public appetite is. I'd like to see it tested, but I don't know, and I think it's because of what I said earlier. I mean, maybe there are other explanations for the way that we have behaved as an electorate over many years, but I really do think it is the case that we interpret fair go as, dumb luck, and finders keepers, and you should never take any money away from money that somebody's got, no matter how they got it, unless I guess it was through criminal activity. And the celebration of plunder. But I was kind of shocked when I witnessed firsthand the efficacy, the power actually of the Minerals Council's campaign against the resources super profits tax. The biggest, most profitable companies in Australia, and a government that was in a reasonable political position at that time. Well, maybe not as good as I thought. And so there is something in the Australian psyche that does not like to see wealth taken from anybody. I've often wondered, somebody here would be a better economic historian than me, how much of this goes back to the Eureka Stockade. The reason I say that is because, I don't know if you know this, it was not until 1987 that any activity associated with gold mining paid 1 cent of tax. Wow. 1987. I reckon the Eureka Stockade has on. And by the way, one of my distant relatives in the long gone past was associated with that stockade and ended up being Minister for Mines in the Victorian government. Oh, he also started the Daily Telegraph here in Sydney. Explains a lot.
Thanks so much. Member of the Society and also former student of Marty Senate. Thanks for that. I was just wondering if you might comment on the prospect or realistic hope of some sort of loose alliance between government or emboldened by government, between those market forces that may provide a counterweight to the kind of interests or mindset that you've described. Unknown caller. And civil society as well. So, for example, the farmers in that natural capital example you mentioned presumably are a kind of political economic voice or power that could be brought to the fore. But renewable sector, you can go on, manufacturing sector. Do you see any realistic sort of prospect of a counter movement?
Great question. So, I hope you're right. I mean, you're asking the question, but rather than putting a proposition, but what's implicit in it in your question, I think, is that it must be possible to marshal those interests who benefit from change to be a force for good rather than a force of opposition. So here's something to reflect on. I'm sorry that I always come to the bad news rather than the good news, but look, about a month ago, Climate Change Authority released its report on its carbon projections for the 6 sectors that make up the Australian economy. So they were tracking or projecting, forecasting, if you like, what was going to happen to the carbon emissions under the government's 6 sectoral decarbonisation strategies that they're developing independently. And one of the findings that they came up, and they're going out to 2050, and one of the findings they came up with was this. Just a little bit about the composition of Australia's carbon emissions at the moment. As you know, the natural environment, the landscape naturally sequesters carbon. If you just leave it alone, it'll absorb carbon in the growth of vegetation and grasses and soil and peat and all that kind of stuff, right? That's how the carbon got there in the first place, before we interrupted. So that's a natural process. That natural process in Australia today is sequestering 90 million tonnes of carbon in a year. 90 million tonnes, okay? But everything else that we're doing, including the cows that are belching methane, but also all the industrial processes, and excluding all the carbon embodied in the fossil fuels that we export and get somebody else to burn rather than us, that contributes 520 million tonnes of carbon a year to our emissions. So our net emissions are 430. So that's our starting point. When we say we're going to get to net zero by 2050, we're saying that 430 has to get down to zero. So the Climate Change Authority has asked itself this question. All right, so let's forget about the land sector for a moment, just for a moment. Where do we think the 5 other sectors, where do we think, plus agriculture, where do we think they're going to end up by 2050 if the government does everything that the government appears to be wanting to do and we make use of every known technology, blah, blah, blah? Answer, they reckon that we can get the 520 down to 130. That's pretty incredible. That's incredible. But the other way of looking at it is that land, instead of absorbing 90, is going to have to absorb 130 million tonnes of carbon a year. Now, actually, that's a bit of a fiddle on my part, because they do say, but it won't have to absorb as much if we can find some new technology that can draw carbon out of the atmosphere, right? Like, direct air capture that people, like Bill Gates kept talking about. And Elon Musk. Anyway. But unless you can find some new technology of that sort, then the agriculture sector is going to have to absorb 130 million tonnes. The land sector, I mean, absorb 130 million tonnes rather than 90. That's a big increase in carbon sequestration in the Australian landscape. I look at that and I say, fantastic opportunity. A new revenue stream for farmers. The president of the National Farmers Federation obviously had the press release loaded in the barrel. As soon as that report came out, the press release, bang, it was out and it said, no way are we having more trees across Australia's farmland. I still agree with you. We're going to have to talk to farmers and not the National Farmers Federation. But it's not easy this time.
Look, we're committed to finishing at 2, so I'm sorry, Guy, we can't take the question. I'm going to hand over to Christina. Thanks.
I'm here to thank you, so you don't have to listen. You can turn away, eat. I first of all want to thank, in particular, Dom and Roy for beginning this series, and Wendy and Ralph at the Union Club for hosting it, because I think this has been a fantastic start of our provocation. I've had a better case of a public intellectual contributing to civil society than you've given us today. I wanted to say just one slight personal note. My mother was an economist in Peter Carmel's group at Flinders. And just before she died in 2009, and I was living in England, I came back and she said, look, things are going to be okay, Chris. Wholesale reform of taxation, the white paper's out. Thank God, we've been waiting for it forever. It's going to be fine, she said. Well, very sadly, she died at the end of that year, but I've always felt glad that she thought we were going to solve it. We had I'm just amazed at your ability to cut across these wide areas. I remember reading you saying somewhere that fuzzy concepts can be measured. Now, I didn't do economics, I went into logic, and I used to do fuzzy logics, and we had fuzzy logics that went fuzzy all the way down. There are much better mathematicians than me here who could explain it, but what happens with you is that you're not fuzzy all the way down. I've never heard such clarity of talk, and again, it takes me back to those Carmel and Wallace and Harcourt, you know them all,
I know.
you know, around the dinner table. They used to talk deep into the night.
Look at you.
With the glass, well, I was a school kid. I thought it was pretty heavy going, but please have something in mind. But always with this combination of a sense of social responsibility, looking for the good of society, very, very, very clever economists. I mean, I do think economists are very clever, but with this clarity and sense of responsibility, which I think is even more important now than ever. The other thing I do want to say something about is your turn of phrase, which is just extraordinary. I started writing them down as you got going, and then my scribbles got incomprehensible, but certainly a fair go is plunder, dumb luck, and finders keepers. I don't think any of us will ever forget that. Or we idolise those who plunder the most. And quite a lot of your other unbelievably elegant phrasing, I think, has helped us. I think we have come out of this, well, actually, with a sense that at least we've got people thinking through these questions and dealing with them. And from our point of view, I think that's what we think we have to do. So I'm extremely grateful, and we have here